In 2010, two paleontologists at Montana State University published a paper that, if it had been fully accepted by the rest of the field, would have quietly erased one of the most recognizable dinosaur names on the planet. Not some obscure genus known from a single toe bone. Torosaurus, a massive horned dinosaur carrying one of the largest skulls of any land animal that has ever lived. A name that's been sitting in textbooks and toy aisles for well over a century. The argument wasn't that Torosaurus never existed, it was that it never needed its own name in the first place, because according to John Scannella and Jack Horner, every Torosaurus skeleton ever found was actually just an old Triceratops. To understand why that claim landed as hard as it did, you need to understand how similar and how different these two animals actually are. Both were named by the same 19th century paleontologist, Othniel Charles Marsh, during the frantic competitive height of what's often called the Bone Wars. Triceratops came first, described in 1889. Torosaurus followed 2 years later, in 1891. Both are chasmosauran ceratopsids, the broad family of large, quadrupedal, horned dinosaurs typified by a beak, brow horns, and a bony frill extending back over the neck. And both lived right at the very end of the Cretaceous, in the same formations, sharing the same landscape, the same predators, and, as far as anyone can tell, the same general lifestyle. The obvious difference sits in the frill itself. A Triceratops frill is relatively short and, crucially, solid, a continuous sheet of bone with no major openings. A Torosaurus frill is dramatically longer, elongated well past the back of the skull, and perforated by two large, window-like openings called fenestrae, a structure that, combined with its overall size, makes Torosaurus's skull one of the single largest known from any land animal in Earth's history, human included, dinosaur or otherwise. Scannella and Horner's argument, published in the Journal of Vertebrate Paleontology under the almost gleefully direct title Torosaurus Marsh, 1891, is Triceratops Marsh. 1889 rested on several converging lines of evidence, all pointing toward the same conclusion, that a Triceratops skull doesn't stop changing shape once the animal reaches typical adult size, the way most animals' skulls do. Bone histology, the microscopic structure of the skull material itself, showed signs of what's called metaplastic tissue, a type of bone capable of continuing to remodel and reshape itself, well beyond the point where ordinary bone growth would have stopped. They also pointed to a well-documented shift in horn orientation across a Triceratops' life, with the brow horns curving backward in younger individuals and sweeping forward as animals matured, a genuine, already accepted growth trend, used as supporting evidence that Triceratops skulls kept transforming late into life. But the most specific, most pointed piece of evidence in the paper was this. Examining a sample of what everyone agreed were subadult Triceratops skulls, not fully adult and not Torosaurus, Scannella and Horner found that roughly half of them had noticeably thin patches of bone on the frill, sitting in precisely the same location where Torosaurus's large fenestrae eventually open up. Their interpretation was that these thin spots were caught mid-transformation, evidence of a bone actively in the process of hollowing out into a hole, meaning a young Triceratops frill was already showing you exactly where it was eventually headed, if the individual just lived long enough to get there. If that reading was correct, the consequences went beyond just an interesting biology paper. Under the rules of zoological nomenclature, when two named species turn out to be the same animal, the older name takes priority, and everything gets folded under it. Triceratops was named first in 1889. Torosaurus followed 2 years later, which meant that if Scannella and Horner were right, the correct scientific outcome wasn't a fun trivia fact about growth stages. It was the formal retirement of the name Torosaurus altogether, with every specimen ever assigned to it reclassified as a very old, very large Triceratops. One of the two most famous horned dinosaurs most people can name off the top of their head would officially stop existing as its own genus. That's obviously not a small claim to drop on the field, and it didn't sit unchallenged for long. In 2012, paleontologists Nicholas Longrich and Daniel Field published a detailed morphometric and comparative study specifically designed to test whether the fossil record actually showed the kind of clean, continuous growth sequence Scannella-Horner's hypothesis required, and what they found complicated the picture considerably. If Torosaurus really is just elderly Triceratops, you'd expect the two forms to occupy distinct, largely non-overlapping windows of maturity. Young, solid-frilled Triceratops on one end and old, fenestrated Torosaurus on the other, with the thin spot specimens bridging the gap in between. Instead, Longrich and Field identified physically mature, fully adult Triceratops specimens that had never developed anything resembling Torosaurus's frill openings. Animals old enough by every other skeletal marker to have made the transition, if the transition were simply a function of age, but that stubbornly hadn't. And on the other side, they pointed to specimens classified as Torosaurus that appeared, by the same maturity markers, to be considerably younger than fully grown, already carrying the large fenestrae the hypothesis says shouldn't show up until very late in life. One particular specimen, cataloged as YPM 1831 and sometimes referred to as Torosaurus gladius, became a genuine flashpoint in the debate, interpreted by Longrich and Field as osteologically immature despite already displaying full Torosaurus-style fenestrae, a direct contradiction of the growth series timeline if the reading holds up. It's worth being honest that this specific specimen comes with its own complications, since it's heavily reconstructed with plaster, and happens to be among the largest skulls ever assigned to Torosaurus. Both facts that make drawing firm conclusions from it genuinely difficult in either direction. There's a third character in this story worth knowing about too, because for a while it looked like it might actually settle the argument, and instead it mostly just added another layer of uncertainty. A single fragmentary skull, originally described under the name Diceratops and later renamed Nedoceratops, shows a frill with small partial openings, not quite as solid as a typical Triceratops, not quite as large and fully formed as a typical Torosaurus. For a moment, that made it an appealing candidate for exactly the kind of transitional in-between specimen the growth series hypothesis needed to find. But a closer study led by paleontologist Andrew Farke concluded that the openings in the Nedoceratops skull most likely resulted from disease or injury during the animal's life, rather than representing a genuine, healthy developmental stage on the road toward a Torosaurus-style frill, and that the shape of those openings didn't actually match the form seen in confirmed Torosaurus specimens anyway. Nedoceratops's own taxonomic status remains unsettled independent of any of this, with some current reviews treating it as a nomen dubium, a name too poorly supported by its fragmentary holotype to confidently apply to anything, while other researchers still carry it forward as a valid, distinct genus in their own analyses. So the one specimen that looked, for a while, like it might referee the entire Triceratops-Torosaurus argument, turned out to have a murky, contested identity of its own, more complicating witness than tiebreaker. So where does that actually leave things as honestly as the current evidence allows? Genuinely unresolved, and worth sitting with as unresolved, rather than forcing a tidy answer either way. Scannella-Horner's core observations haven't been discredited. The metaplastic bone tissue is real. The changing horn orientation with age is real and independently well documented. The thin patches showing up in roughly half of sampled subadult frills, in exactly the right location, are real too. And they're a genuinely strange thing to find if the two animals have nothing developmental to do with each other. But Longrich and Field's central objection hasn't been resolved either, because a clean, one-directional growth series should not produce fully mature Triceratops with solid frills sitting comfortably alongside less mature Torosaurus, already carrying open ones. Both sets of observations currently exist in the same body of published literature, pointing in different directions, and the field hasn't converged on which one wins. More stratigraphic data, more histological sampling, and ideally a genuinely uncontested transitional specimen, something without plaster reconstruction, without disease, without any ambiguity about its maturity, would go a long way toward finally closing this out. As of right now, that specimen hasn't turned up. There's something worth appreciating in a story that doesn't get to end with a clean resolution, especially after a run of videos on this channel that mostly have. Not every argument in paleontology gets its dueling dinosaurs moment, its single decisive CT scan, its one closing paper that makes everyone else fall in line. Sometimes the honest answer, even for two dinosaurs as famous and as thoroughly studied as these, is that the data itself is still arguing with each other, and the responsible thing for anyone telling this story to do is admit that, rather than pick a side and pretend the debate is settled, because a tidy ending makes for a better final line. What isn't in question is how genuinely strange it is that this argument exists at all. Triceratops is arguably the single most recognizable dinosaur on the planet that isn't actively trying to eat something in a museum diorama. And there is, right now, a real, published, still active scientific disagreement over whether one of its closest relatives is actually a separate animal, or whether it's just what Triceratops looks like if you let it keep living. Alright, speaking of famous dinosaurs with an unresolved mystery attached, next time we're finally doing the big one you've been asking for. Tyrannosaurus rex, specifically the single most famous T-Rex skeleton ever found, nicknamed Sue, and the almost unbelievable discovery buried inside one of her leg bones. Soft, flexible tissue and structures that looked like blood vessels. Recovered from a bone that's supposed to be 68 million years old, and the fight over what that actually means that's been running ever since. That one's next. Let me know in the comments what you want cataloged after that, and subscribe to Claw Catalog so you're here for it.